What happens when a man becomes more powerful than a nation? What becomes of a world where one voice can command millions to live or to die? Behind every revolution, there's a dreamer. But behind every tyranny, a shadow. He called himself the Man of Steel. But even steel can rust. This is not merely the story of Joseph Stalin. This is the story of how one man's rise built an empire, and how that same hand plunged it into fear, silence, and blood. This is not just a tale of politics. It is a tale of betrayal, ambition, cruelty, and survival. This is the rise and fall of Joseph Stalin. He was born Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili in December 1878 in the rough little town of Gori in Georgia, then a part of the Russian Empire. His father, Bessarion, a shoemaker by trade, was a violent alcoholic. His fists ruled the house. His mother, Ketevan, was quiet, devout, and desperate. She held tight to her son, not just out of love, but as a shield from poverty, from humiliation, from the drunk storms that shattered their home. From a young age, Iosif learned something dangerous. The world is cruel, and only the strong survive. In the streets of Gori, he was mocked for his small size, his withered arm from a childhood accident, and his peasant clothes. But the boy learned to endure, to hide pain, to smile at enemies while clenching fists behind his back. His mother sent him to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, hoping the priesthood might save him. But Yosef didn't find God. Instead, Stalin found rebellion within himself. It was in the pages of Marx, Lenin, and Bakunin that young Stalin, still just so-so to his friends, discovered his true religion, revolution. He read in secret, met in hidden rooms. He didn't preach salvation. He plotted upheaval. And so, the boy who was once beaten by his father began to dream of a world where no one, not even God, could control him again. He left the seminary, left the cross. He became Koba, a name from a Georgian folktale, a Robin Hood-like rebel who fought injustice with a gun. Koba wasn't a speaker. He wasn't charismatic like Trotsky or poetic like Lenin. But he was useful. He robbed banks to fund the revolution, smuggled weapons, escaped prisons, and always watched from the shadows. The fire of revolution had scorched the Russian Empire, and by 1921, the Bolsheviks stood victorious. But peace did not follow. Instead, Russia lay in ruins. Famine gripped the land. Civil war had drained its lifeblood, and the utopia Lenin had promised teetered on the brink of collapse. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed under the weight of war and starvation. The Tsar fell, and the Bolsheviks seized the moment. In March 1921, facing mass rebellions, including the devastating Kronstadt uprising led by disillusioned sailors once loyal to the Bolshevik, he introduced the new economic policy, NEP, a retreat from war communism, allowing small private businesses and limited market freedom. It was, in Lenin's words, a strategic retreat, a compromise to save the revolution. But even as the country gasped for breath, a new struggle began, one not on the battlefield, but within the heart of the Bolshevik Party. A power struggle. By 1922, Lenin's health had sharply declined. He suffered his first stroke in May. He recovered partially, but the damage was done. Behind closed doors, a silent war raged between those who eyed succession. Lenin watched it unfold with growing dread. He grew increasingly suspicious of one man, Joseph Stalin, a quiet, methodical figure who had risen swiftly through the ranks. Appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, Stalin now held the power to appoint and dismiss key officials. It was a role that seemed administrative, but it was anything but. In private notes and letters, Lenin expressed deep concern. In what would later be known as Lenin's Testament, he warned, "Stalin is too rude, and this defect becomes unbearable in a Secretary General. I suggest that comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from this position." But fate silenced Lenin before he could act. He suffered a second stroke in December 1922, then a third in March 1923, which left him nearly speechless and paralyzed. His political voice was gone. though his mind remained painfully aware. In his final months, he lived in isolation at his estate in Gorky, dictating fragments of thought, cut off from the machine he had built. He died on January 21st, 1924, at the age of 53. His body was embalmed and displayed in Red Square, as the myth of Lenin was elevated to a near-religious status. The man who had decried all forms of cult worship was now a symbol, immortalized by the very system he had birthed. But behind the marble mausoleum and revolutionary songs, something darker stirred. The power vacuum he left behind would be filled not by collective leadership, but by the iron grip of Joseph Stalin, the very man Lenin had feared most in his final days. When Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The revolutionary fire had subdued. The civil war had ended. But the question that now loomed over the entire communist world was simple, terrifying, and urgent. Who would replace Lenin? There was no crown to inherit, no clear line of succession. Only a vacuum, wide and dangerous, at the very heart of the world's first socialist state. At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. Leon Trotsky, hero of the Civil War, creator of the Red Army. Brilliant, charismatic, and adored by the revolutionary base. He was seen by many, both inside and outside the party, as the natural successor. But power in the Soviet Union did not lie in charisma alone. It lay in the party. And in the party, Joseph Stalin had already begun laying his quiet trap. By 1924, Stalin was the General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role considered administrative and uninspiring. But that title was deceptive. As General Secretary, Stalin had access to every personnel file, every regional report, every whisper from every district. He appointed allies, silenced critics. Slowly, he was turning the party into his machine. While Trotsky wrote books and gave speeches, Stalin listened. He networked. He waited. And then, he moved. In the months after Lenin's death, Stalin positioned himself as the guardian of Lenin's legacy. Posters appeared showing Stalin beside Lenin. Speeches were made praising Stalin's loyalty. Schoolbooks began calling him the faithful student. Meanwhile, Lenin's testament, a secret document written before Lenin's death, where he warned that Stalin was too dangerous to lead, was quietly buried by Stalin's allies in the Politburo. The public never saw it. Stalin knew he couldn't challenge Trotsky alone. So he formed a temporary alliance with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two senior Bolsheviks who also feared Trotsky's dominance. Together, they painted Trotsky as arrogant, out of touch, and even counter-revolutionary. They attacked him on ideological grounds. They criticized his absence from Lenin's funeral. They turned the party against him, not with bullets, but with votes. Trotsky, caught off guard, found himself increasingly isolated. But Stalin's alliances were never meant to last. By 1926, Stalin had turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev as well. He now formed a new bloc, the right opposition, alongside Nikolai Bukharin, Mikhail Tomsky, and Alexei Rykov. This new alliance supported Stalin's policy of continuing the new economic policy, INEP, a partial reintroduction of limited capitalism that Lenin had once used to stabilize the economy. Stalin, the supposed centrist, now appeared as the voice of moderation, balance, and order. But it was a mask. By 1928, Stalin betrayed Bukharin and the right as well. With Trotsky already exiled and the left opposition crushed, Stalin abruptly turned against the NEP and announced a new direction: rapid industrialization and forced collectivization. This dramatic pivot shocked his former allies. Bukharin protested, warning that such policies would bring disaster. But Stalin didn't care. He had done what no other man in the party could. He had defeated the left, then the right. He had played factions against each other. And by 1928, he stood alone. There was no official ceremony, no title of supreme leader. But by the end of 1928, it was clear. Joseph Stalin had replaced Lenin, not through revolutionary glory, not through popular acclaim, but through bureaucracy, strategy, and relentless manipulation. The man who once called himself a modest party worker had transformed into the most powerful figure in the Soviet Union. But the story was far from over. Because now that Stalin held power, he would stop at nothing to keep it. In 1928, Joseph Stalin stood at the gates of transformation. The Soviet Union was vast but poor. It was a country of wooden plows and oil lamps, peasant carts and forgotten villages. To Stalin, this was intolerable. "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries," he said. "We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us." And with that, he launched the first 5-year plan, a radical, ruthless blueprint to industrialize the Soviet Union at lightning speed. The goals were staggering: coal production to double, steel output to triple, hundreds of new factories, hydroelectric stations, and entire cities were to be built from nothing. Places like Magnitogorsk, once empty wilderness, became monuments of industrial ambition. Workers toiled day and night, sleeping in tents, digging with frozen hands, dreaming of a socialist future. Propaganda roared through radios and posters. "There are no fortresses the Bolsheviks cannot storm." But behind the triumphal slogans, reality was brutal. Machines broke down, resources ran out, skilled engineers were scarce, workers collapsed from exhaustion, deadlines were impossible, but no one dared complain. Because failure was treason. To fuel industry, Stalin needed grain, but the countryside resisted. Millions of peasants still lived under the new economic policy, which had allowed small-scale private farming. That era was now over. Stalin demanded collectivization, the merging of individual farms into massive, state-controlled collectives. Those who resisted were branded kulaks, enemies of the people. Their land was seized, their animals slaughtered, their families deported to Siberia or worse. Grain was extracted by force. Armed requisition squads combed the villages, leaving empty barns and starving mouths. Entire communities were uprooted. The countryside bled. In 1932, as resistance to collectivization intensified, Stalin retaliated. Quotas were raised beyond reason. Food was confiscated to meet targets. Even seed grain was taken. Villages that failed to deliver were blacklisted, cut off from supplies, trade, and food. People began to eat grass, bark, even their own animals. By the time the winter snow melted, millions were dead. This famine, later called the Holodomor, was no accident. It was policy. Back in the cities, a different story was told. Newspapers celebrated workers like Alexei Stakhanov, who allegedly mined 14 times his quota in one shift. Such Stakhanovites became heroes of Soviet labor, used to inspire others. In truth, much of the data was manipulated. Numbers were inflated. Success was staged. But none of that mattered to Stalin. What mattered was control. By 1932, the first 5-year plan had officially ended. The targets? Missed or faked. The human cost? Unimaginable. But Stalin declared victory. New factories now dotted the skyline. Coal and steel output had surged. The USSR was no longer a backward agrarian country. It was becoming a modern industrial power. But the cost was measured not in rubles or tons. It was measured in bones buried beneath the soil, in the silence of broken families, in the fear that settled like ash across the land. The first 5-year plan wasn't just an economic program. It was Stalin's vision made real. A militarized society, a centralized machine, a nation rebuilt not with compromise, but with command. And it laid the foundation for everything that followed. The purges, the terror, the victory in World War II, the Cold War. But it also left a question that haunts history. What kind of future is worth building if it must be bought with so much death? By 1939, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. Nazi Germany had annexed Austria and dismantled Czechoslovakia. Hitler's next target was clear: Poland. But there was one problem. If he attacked, would the Soviet Union intervene? And in Moscow, Stalin watched, calculating. The Soviet Union had long warned of the threat of fascism. Hitler had condemned Bolshevism in Mein Kampf. Their ideologies were sworn enemies. But Stalin no longer trusted the West. In March 1939, Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence, but their diplomatic efforts were slow and uncertain. They hesitated to offer Stalin what he truly wanted: territorial security. So when Nazi diplomats came knocking, offering land and peace, Stalin listened. On August 23, 1939, in the dead of night, the impossible happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Officially, it was a treaty of peace between two sovereign powers. But hidden in a secret protocol, the real deal was far darker. Poland would be divided between the two. The Soviet Union would get Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and parts of Romania. Hitler would have a free hand to move west. It was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it. The world was stunned. Two ideological enemies, now partners. Lenin's revolution had once promised to fight imperialism. Now, his successor had made a deal with its greatest monster. Just 1 week later, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. And on September 17th, as Polish forces were stretched thin, the Red Army invaded from the east. The two dictators carved up the country like vultures dividing a corpse. In cities like Brest-Litovsk, German and Soviet troops met and saluted one another. Poland ceased to exist. World War II had begun. With the West now at war, Stalin moved to claim his rewards. In the Baltics, Soviet troops marched in and installed puppet governments. In Romania, the USSR seized Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. In Finland, Stalin launched a brutal attack in the Winter War, 1939 to 1940. The Red Army suffered heavy losses, exposing deep flaws in Soviet military leadership, a legacy of Stalin's purges. But eventually, the Finns were forced to concede territory. Across Eastern Europe, Stalin now ruled over tens of millions of new subjects. But peace with Hitler was always temporary. Despite the pact, Stalin never trusted Hitler. He expanded military production, moved industries eastward, and built buffer zones. But he also honored the agreement, sending Germany oil, grain, and raw materials, supplies that would later fuel the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, Hitler grew increasingly obsessed with his next goal: Lebensraum, living space in the East. And in Stalin's eyes, Hitler's growing presence in Eastern Europe, and especially the Balkans, was a threat. But he hoped the pact would hold, at least a little longer. In May 1941, Soviet intelligence warned of an imminent German invasion. British spies sent similar reports. Even German defectors whispered of tanks moving east, but Stalin refused to believe it. He dismissed the warnings as Western trickery. He had staked everything on the idea that Hitler wouldn't be foolish enough to open a second front. In 1945, Stalin stood atop the ashes of Hitler's Reich. He was hailed as the savior of Europe. At Yalta, he sat beside Churchill and Roosevelt, carving up the post-war world like a butcher at a banquet. The Soviet flag flew over Eastern Europe, and behind the Iron Curtain, Stalin's shadow stretched wider than ever. The year is 1950. The Soviet Union has emerged from the ashes of World War II, not just victorious, but transformed. From Berlin to Beijing, communist flags wave across half the world. Eastern Europe kneels behind the Iron Curtain. And in Asia, Mao Zedong's China now salutes Moscow. Joseph Stalin sits at the heart of it all, an aging titan, his face carved into statues, his name sung by children, his orders carried out without question. But behind the grand parades and portraits, the old dictator is growing increasingly paranoid. In these final years, Stalin trusts almost no one, even his closest allies. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev live in constant fear. One wrong word, one awkward glance, and they could vanish into the night. The shadow of Stalin's purges still hangs over every meeting, every decision. He calls late-night sessions, sometimes until dawn, forcing exhausted men to drink with him while he watches, listens, tests their loyalty. Behind closed doors, he rewrites history again, downplaying the roles of wartime generals, minimizing others' contributions, elevating himself as the sole architect of Soviet victory. Stalin is no longer building a state. He is building a myth. In 1950, war erupts on the Korean peninsula. North Korean troops invade the South, sparking the first major conflict of the Cold War. The United States and its allies intervene. China joins the fight. The Soviet Union, from the shadows, provides weapons, pilots, and strategy. It's a dangerous dance. Nuclear powers facing off through proxy war. Stalin watches with interest, letting others bleed while his power expands. But even this global game cannot distract him from enemies at home. Or rather, the enemies he believes are there. In 1952, Stalin begins one of his most sinister campaigns, the Doctors' Plot. A group of prominent Soviet doctors, many of them Jewish, are accused of conspiring to poison high-ranking officials. The charges are baseless, but the arrests begin. Confessions are extracted through torture. Anti-Semitic rhetoric floods newspapers. Fear ripples through Moscow's Jewish population. The party grows nervous. Even the inner circle begins to wonder. Is Stalin planning one final bloodletting before he dies? By early 1953, Stalin's health is failing. He is 73, his body heavy, his movements slower, but his mind still calculating. He lives mostly alone at his dacha outside Moscow, surrounded by guards who fear even waking him. On the night of March 1st, Stalin hosts a gathering with Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, and Khrushchev. They drink late, laugh, watch films. Then, Stalin retires to his private room, but did not come out the next morning. Hours had passed, and no one dared to enter. Only late in the evening do guards finally open the door. Stalin is found on the floor, paralyzed, unconscious, soaked in urine. He had suffered a stroke, but even then, no doctor is called. Why? Because the best doctors are in prison, accused by Stalin himself. For 2 more days, Stalin lingers, semi-conscious, his breath ragged. Finally, on March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. Stalin's death was announced on March 6, 1953, and his body was embalmed and then displayed at the House of Unions in Moscow for 3 days. At his funeral on March 9, 1953, Stalin was buried in the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square. The man who ruled with absolute control, who reshaped continents and buried millions, was gone. No bullets, no assassins, only a slow collapse and silence. His death unleashes chaos and relief. Crowds flood the streets in mourning. Inside the Kremlin, his terrified successors rush to undo his latest purges and accusations. History remembers him not as a man, but as a storm that reshaped a nation and scarred it forever. For some, Joseph Stalin was the architect of Soviet strength, the man who turned a fractured, backward empire into a superpower capable of standing toe-to-toe with the might of Nazi Germany and winning. For others, he was the executioner of a dream, twisting the ideals of the revolution into a machinery of fear, blood, and silence. Under his hand, steel replaced wood, factories replaced fields, and the Red Army rose as an iron fist. But so too did the camps, the mass graves, and the whispers in the dark. The air of progress was heavy with the scent of loss. To his supporters, he left behind a Soviet Union unbroken, victorious, and feared by the world. To his victims, he left only an unmarked grave, a name erased from family records, a photograph torn in half. Even decades after his death in 1953, his shadow loomed over Russia and beyond. Streets still bore his name. Statues stood, defiant against the winds of change. Some bowed to them in respect, others spat at their base. Stalin's legacy is a contradiction carved in stone, both savior and destroyer, both father and tyrant. He is the proof that power can build an empire and crush its people. And as long as history is told, his name will echo, not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap, warning the world of the price of absolute power. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Relic Saga channel. If you have any other interesting characters to discuss, let us know in the comments.